Fromsoftware has had a long and storied history when it comes to the classic 2-enemy boss fight setup. Of course, they're not the ones that invented this sort of encounter, but it does feel like they really made it their own by perfecting the format and creating some of the most iconic bosses ever. I mean, when people talk about the hardest, or maybe even the best boss fights in gaming, everyone has had this cutscene stick out in their brain after the release of Dark Souls. And that speaks volumes, given how many in that game alone you can point to as a memorable experience, let alone the series. So with that said, what the hell happened to the duo fights in Elden Ring? It's not the first game of theirs to have flops in this department, but there's many examples in the game that just makes you wonder how they couldn't touch them up to make them a better experience overall. And well, we're going to discuss a chunk of them today. There will be one singular term that unifies this entire discussion, and I think is crucial for a multi-enemy fight to be good, but I will withhold using it until the end of the video. So if you'd like to join me on a thought experiment, let's see if you can think of it either now or as the video goes on. Up to you whether you want to comment it or not. Just to be clear though, we're pretty much only going to discuss duo boss fights. If there's more than 2 enemies in the boss room, we'll touch on some of them briefly towards the end, but the bulk of the video will be on 2 enemy encounters, as those are a lot more feasible to have a tighter design. Anything above that can quickly devolve into chaos, intentionally or not. I do want to clarify something before getting into it. I do stay in touch with general discussions and debates on the game. Despite this, and even though I make Elden Ring videos myself, I haven't really consumed many Elden Ring YouTube videos at all. Outside of lore videos, and maybe stuff like Zully the Witch, I can probably count on one hand the amount of videos I've watched that specifically covered the gameplay or design. One of the sole exceptions is this video by Nazu on the multi-boss fights. Now I probably watched it shortly after the video was released, so I haven't watched it since, but I'm saying this for full disclosure. I know there's at least one point I took from that video, and I will point it out when we get there. I did write this script before rewatching it, in hopes that I could still form my own points without direct influence. I'm sure there's some overlap of things we discuss, because some of the discussions have been happening since the launch of Elden Ring. But I will rewatch Nazu's video after writing the script, and if I notice I subconsciously took any other points that sound like something I didn't think of prior to watching their video, I'll point those out too. Before getting into the flawed duo bosses, let's take a look at the more successful fights in Elden Ring, so we can contrast them to the less successful ones later. This will probably be a strange one to start off, but it's worth noting that there's not many major duo fights in the game. The first boss fight I want to look at is a duo Erdtree burial watchdogs in minor Erdtree catacombs. It doesn't seem like it has any tweaking to their AI to accommodate this as a duo fight, but they are pretty damn slow, naturally becoming simple to manage both. They're not helpless from afar however, because one of them does have ranged options that will force you to move. And the room in itself is pretty small, which normally is a downside for multi-enemy fights. But in this case, it's just small enough to not let you get too comfortable, but not too much to where the room size actually becomes a nuisance, because they are very slow to approach you. Individually, they're also not super complex or difficult bosses per se. Most of their attacks are very slow and calculated, so you can even dodge both of them in a lot of situations. Hopefully by the time you reach these ones, you've at least encountered one or two to at least know their tricky attacks. But even if not, it might not be too difficult to learn them on the fly if this is your first encounter. It's just a boss format that works out without needing tweaking. So for once, I'm actually kinda glad that they decided to make a boss that's just a dupe really. If you played the game at launch like me, you likely didn't get to appreciate the boss more because the stake of America was freaking broken, and the run up without it wasn't fun or short, making attempts annoying as hell. But obviously it wasn't intended, and it's fixed now. The next one I want to talk about is the Crucible Knight duel fight with Ordovis in Auriza Hero's Grave. This one I do feel genuinely has had tweaking to make sure that their aggro doesn't overlap too much. Because in different attempts, I have had a different knight aggroed in the beginning of the fight, this one being incredibly aggressive, and the other one being surprisingly passive and standing back, even the spear one. And this is definitely a big pro if a duel fight has some custom programming to adjust the encounter, especially when it could be considered a normal enemy. It's not a perfect fight, mind you, it can still be a little frustrating. Obviously they can still occasionally both attack at the same time if you're too close to even the passive one. Some of the attacks that the individual enemies have can be really punishing for an encounter like this, like the one far-reaching poke attack they like to do to heal punish you. That's definitely very extra when you have 2 enemies in your ass and you need to run a mile to get a heal off. This one is probably a bit of an oversight, but who knows if they would have decided to program the attack out. But even so, I still find the encounter pretty decent. The boss room experience is similar to the last one. It's bigger but not too big, you still have to be on your toes. There are indestructible pillars there, but they're probably a limited help anyhow. There's one that's more optimal to kill first, just like Ornstein and Smell, the spear one, because the shield one will be prone to blocking you of course. And if you're worried about the other enemy, you may not have time to try to bait it to attack and then punish as the first opponent. That's not a pro or a con necessarily, you can always try the other one too, just wanted to bring it up. The last good example is one I only partly jokingly have said in the past is probably the best duel fight in this game, the Fel twins before the Divine Tower of East Altus. Obviously this is a very simple fight. It's mostly just two different types of Omen enemies, but even if they didn't change a single thing about their behavior, it works out surprisingly well. The Bleed Omen is much more aggressive and comes at you instantly in the fight. Meanwhile, the Wraith Omen approaches much more slowly, which is just a classic, simple way to have a dual enemy boss fight be more manageable. It's hard to tell how big the arena is obviously, but I've never had it be an issue. Might as well be infinite for all I know. But it's definitely big enough that you can maneuver both of them without a problem, which is important since there's nothing blocking their way. I'd say it's considerably the easiest boss we've talked about so far, maybe for the rest of the video too, at least once you know the Omen moveset, because they can be quite brutal at first, but I think it's good to highlight it nonetheless, because it's a simple format that's very effective. So now to look at the less favorable examples in the Elden Ring boss roster. For full disclosure, the Valiant Gargoyles are very close to being good. A lot of the bedrock for a good boss fight are there. The second one only comes in when the first gargoyle is at half health, allowing for some degree of burst of DPS before the second one shows up. There seems to be a genuine attempt at having their AI not be fully aggressive when both are in the arena, those kinds of things. But there's a few details that hold it back a good amount. Firstly, even though they do seem to tag in and out, possibly indicated by one of them jumping back, that's still not the greatest feedback to know which one of them is the aggressive gargoyle at any given moment. To demonstrate a successful example of this, let's jump back to Dark Souls 3 and look at the Demon Princes. In this fight, there will generally only be one aggressive demon at a time, with only a small overlap between them, but the way that they depict this is by having the aggressive one be clearly enraged and full of color and fire, and the other will be more grey and deflated. And the way they deflate is by doing a very specific slam down attack that you only see them do when they're burning out. And when one is becoming enraged, you can hear the demon start shrieking, so you'll know it's coming. This is a good example of how to indicate which of the two bosses you should focus your attention on, as the other one will stand back and only shoot some very telegraphed poison attacks from there. Speaking of which, that description just now should have sounded very familiar, but the way that the Valiant Gargoyles do this similar attack is a little flawed. As mentioned, Demon Princess telegraphed this attack well by having a small line of purple particles that don't do anything before the line explodes, which obviously causes damage and causes a lot of toxic buildup. The flaw with the Gargoyle version is that there is no real telegraph. Perhaps you could hear the attack being done, but it's not a particularly loud attack. Meanwhile, the boss can be, not to mention the music. So if you aren't actively looking at the other gargoyle, you would just start taking chip damage, risking poison if you don't have the opportunity to get out of there. The last note for this attack is that the green color of the gargoyle poison attack blends too much with the blue-green of the actual boss arena, so you may not even be able to see it clearly until you're already taking damage. Meanwhile, the vibrant purple attack from Demon Princess stands out plenty. This last point about the color contrast is the only point that I specifically remember getting from the Naza video, as that's not a point I had heard or thought about before they mentioned it, so full credit to them for that. Just as a last little point about the gargoyles, albeit may be rare, in general there are moments when they can both be aggro at the same time, which obviously is very deadly when they're both huge enemies that can cover a lot of ground with their attacks. To be clear, this kind of thing will always happen in multi-enemy encounters. We did mention that before with the Crucible Knights. It's nearly impossible to make a fight like this that won't have a few unfair moments bleed through without insane restrictions being put in place, which risks just making the encounter essentially a solo boss fight with enemies coming in and out, like the Lizalfos mini-boss in Ocarina of Time. This is fine mechanically, but it would result in being a dual boss fight in name only, and doesn't particularly act as that interesting of a fight. Even the Lizalfos are just a mini-boss. But with the aforementioned examples, you should see how the Demon Princes wouldn't have this be a major issue. You'd at least know if both are aggroed at once, and if you don't want to deal with them, you can just wait it out briefly. And not to mention the boss arena for Princes is much bigger relative to the boss than the Gargoyles. The next one is a classic example of an arena just being far too small for the boss fight. And while this can already be a problem in a solo boss, it's doubly problematic for a dual boss fight. And in this case, it's a Mad Pumpkin duel in Caelem Ruins. The arena size issue is accentuated by the fact that not only are the Mad Pumpkins pretty big enemies, bigger than even some of the bosses that are already discussed in this video, which had bigger arenas, but they also have that annoying aspect of being really difficult to hit for effective damage due to their helmet. It's already pretty tedious having to get around them due to the size of their helmet when fighting them solo in the overworld, or the other one singular boss fight, but put two of them in a small room, and it's just not a good time at all. This is one of those bosses that you just prefer to completely outclass with DPS when you're overleveled than try to fight legitimately. And I guess thankfully it is extremely optional, possibly missed by many. These are the only really blatant issues for this one that I can think of, but they're so egregious that I doubt most people would disagree it's not a pleasant encounter. And finally, to look at the most infamous example in the game. So the Godskin duo clearly takes a lot from previous examples in the series, namely Dark Souls 1. The Godskin duo share a singular giant health bar like the 4 kings do, alongside having individual health bars to know when you're about to kill each one. Then looking at Ornstein and Smo, the obvious parallel is the lanky Ornstein and Godskin Apostle, and the more chunky Smo and Godskin Noble. The arenas both also have giant pillars in them that are intended to be put between you and the boss at any given point. But these ONS comparisons are almost purely visual, because mechanically, they're a whole different ballgame. As mentioned earlier, the fast and slow dual fight format is a pretty simple way to balance this type of fight. For instance, Ornstein is the faster of the two in their respective fight, so it's pretty simple to keep him apart from Smo, as he approaches much more slowly. And of course you can use the pillars in the arena to split them up, or heal if you need to. Possibly coincidentally, killing Ornstein first is also the best for most people, as this buffs Smo but keeps most of his moveset the same, instead of completely changing it like Super Ornstein. So it works out pretty well that that's the one that approaches you more consistently. Now, the Godskin duo don't do this very well. Despite being similar in size to Smo, the Noble is actually not a very slow enemy. He moves at least at the same pace as the Apostle, so it's basically a non-factor. The pillars can have some utility when they're intact, but once they've been destroyed, not only are you more of a target through them, both bosses can also get on top of them. That's not to say some of their attacks won't go through the pillars, even if they're still fully intact, although that may be the case for some of Smo's attacks as well in Dark Souls. I would even say that the arena's probably just a tiny bit too cramped too, or at the very least it wouldn't hurt to make it a little bigger. I think the duo are bigger bosses than Ornstein and Smo, but the arena's smaller, so go figure. And the cherry bomb on top of all this? Both of the Godskins can do a ranged attack, and they sure do love doing it while you're trying to get a heal off, usually both at once. We also mentioned Super Ornstein and stuff. These two also have a similar buff, but it will happen when either of them are at full health. And man, trying to fight Super Noble when the other one is still alive sure is a nightmare. But the other one isn't great either. And remember when I mentioned the pillars earlier? One of the attacks that may get over the destroyed pillars is the Super Noble roll attack, but it also may not, so it's a coin flip if it'll even help there. I suppose just like ONS, this one does have a dominant strategy in killing the Apostle first, but neither are favorable options. Once you bring one down, if you got enough DPS and know your way around the singular Godskin, the fight will drop down difficulty significantly, as you can kill them before the second one respawns. But odds are that would happen for someone for a while, certainly not in the first playthrough. They each individually have some issues as well, like I mentioned the input reading on heals for the range attack. I think the Noble has some BS attacks even when fighting it alone. It certainly doesn't go great in this dual fight, so overall it can be a really messy experience. To be honest with you though, they're not the most difficult boss despite all of this once you get used to them, and you're properly leveled for them. They only took me one attempt at throwing this, and then I figured I should leave them alive because I needed more footage. It's not that you can get good at them, or that they're even that bad of a boss. It's just disappointing knowing how heavily this boss drew from ONS, and yet managed to miss the mark on a lot of what made that boss great. The worst part is that this is the only mandatory dual boss fight in the game, and besides Renala, it's also the only major boss that has more than one enemy. So it's just not a great representation of one of the greatest strengths FromSoft has had in their modern career. The good examples in this game are optional and out of the way. Now to cap off the video, let's briefly discuss some of the other multi-enemy boss types that are a standout. Having bosses become regular enemies later on is quite standard in the series at this point. It's almost expected, and it's a very good novelty. It's a way to show your growth as a player that you can take down multiple of an enemy that used to be a boss, even if statistically they're probably not as strong. But when done in reverse, I feel like I don't need to explain this much. These are the bosses that I think about when people say they really padded out the boss list of this game. And that's probably the case for most of you as well, if I had to guess. Now technically it's possible to find these bosses before the enemies, but they're also so widespread in the world that it's hard for them to feel like they are a boss, even if you saw them first. Especially if you can informally find the exact boss setup. I mean hell, the abductor virgins are just in the load screen art. And that opens the door to another problem when it comes to some of these. The open world makes it difficult to appropriately encounter some of these duo fights. For instance, I would argue that the Beastman Afar Missoula duo in Dragon's Barrow is a well-designed boss fight, but I have never encountered this boss at an appropriate level personally. So even the projectiles that are thrown by the ranged Beastmen tend to hurt a lot, and don't have the DPS to take out the other one with the encouraged stealth aspect. And I wouldn't be surprised if most people encountered that at a way too low level. because the differences between Caelid and Dragon's Barrow is not very heavily emphasized, so you might not know how much higher the level recommendation is for Dragon's Barrow, even if you took down Radahn or something. Speaking of which, another one that comes to mind is the Misbegotten Crucible Knight before Radahn. I would also say this one is done well, but it's also very likely that it will come here too early for your own good. Now you could argue this is a skill check before you get to Radahn, but once you realize you can't fight Radahn until the festival happens, the point is basically moot, because you either haven't triggered the festival yet, so if you beat them, you won't get to fight Radahn, or you have triggered the festival, and you can just skip the duel fight entirely. I'm not saying the open world overall is bad because of this issue, or that they are bad in a vacuum, but it's one of those consequences that come about because of how they chose to lay out the game. I have made a video on the open world generally, if you want to see my takes of that specifically. This is nothing to say about the bosses that are like a guy with some extra enemies. Those are pretty generally difficult to get right, especially if you just stick them in a boss room with no tweaking of their AI or how they interact with the fight. The only one I can think of that is done well is Commander Nile, because of how he'll only spawn the 2 enemies, but one of them is passive and slower to reach you, and so is Nile, allowing you to kill the more aggressive knight first. And when both are dead, Nile doesn't become a punching bag. You'll essentially go into a different phase and become a much more challenging boss in its own right. Even the other commander, O'Neill, I feel is done poorly, due to how he summons the 3 axe knights towards the end of the fight. The first round of summons is fine because they're ranged until you get closer to them, but all 3 axe knights are incredibly aggressive and capable of poisoning through lighter weapons, making trades very dangerous. By this point in the video, I would hope that it's clear what the main thing I think duel bosses need to be good, and I do wonder how many of you thought of it. It's crowd control. No, not that kind. And there's many different answers that you could come to make a manageable duo, or even multi-enemy boss fight. A big enough arena, obstacles to use as blockades, some sort of pass the baton mechanic, a slow and fast enemy combination, or simply having the second enemy come in later on in the fight. And to top it off, a tight level curve is almost required for the fight to be satisfying. Otherwise the fight risks being way too hard or way too easy, which is a difficult balance to strike in an open world like this one. There's many examples in Elden Ring that are this close to being phenomenal, because they borrow aspects of this, but by trying to deviate just enough to make them a little more fresh or distinct, they end up becoming worse than a previous example. And ultimately, that's the point I want to end this off on, that a lot of these things shouldn't be happening. FromSoft has been making these types of games for 15 years now. They've had a lot of really good boss designs to draw from their own games. If they're trying unique things with some of these bosses that they haven't done before, maybe I'd cut them some slack. For instance, Man-Eaters from Demon Souls was a pretty rough duel fight in some regards, but it was their first attempt at something like this, so it was actually pretty admirable how it worked out as well as it did. But all in all, Elden Ring has had some pretty standard boss fights, definitely following in a formula, and that's especially the case for the dual ones. And to be clear, I don't think Spirit Ashes are a good excuse for this. Even if they do balance out these fights more, this whole video should have showed that there are examples of how they could have balanced it well for a singular player. And if they did design them to be like this, just because there are Spirit Ashes and such in the game, then it's definitely a very questionable design choice. All the original games had summoning as a core mechanic of the game, so if you want to, you can make the same excuse, but they didn't rely on that. However, here's hoping Shadows of the Erdtree has some good ones, because honestly some of their most unique and fleshed out examples have come from DLCs. So I'd say I still have some high hopes for a cool dual boss fight in there. And that's all for the video. This one I've had in the books for a long time, but I just put it off for a while to work on other things. And I know that it is kind of a treaded topic. I already mentioned Naz's video earlier, but I know there's a handful of other videos on this topic. But I do hope that the structure of it was unique enough. I haven't seen a lot of those videos, so I can't say for sure. And I just think it's good to have a light on it before the DLC comes out, just to be something to think about. Because honestly, a lot of these clever duel fights in the series are some of my favorites, and I want to see more of them. I want to see more of them that actually impress me, and I'm hoping DLC will give us one or two. Could even be a multi-enemy one, not just duel, and I'll take that too. It's definitely one of the disappointing aspects of Elden Ring that, clearly a lot of us have a problem with. So cross your fingers for some good ones. Anyway, this probably will be the last main video I make before DLC comes out. After that, I will be waiting until DLC comes out to see what I want to make content on. Because obviously I can't make content on it without knowing what the actual meat of the DLC will be like. So we shall see how that goes, and if I have many issues with it, or if it's just a good time overall. I do have plans to do something other than videos in this channel as we lead up to the DLC. That will be announced very soon. So stay tuned for that if you think you'll be interested. For now, if you're interested in this kind of content where we analyze some flaws and some really good qualities of Elden Ring, I have made a couple of videos like this in the past if you'd like to check those out. I'll certainly like to make more. I suspect I'll have thoughts about the DLC even if they are good things, so hopefully I'll be inspired by some of that. Do consider subscribing. Thank you for my members for supporting me directly. I appreciate your support. And yeah, I hope to see you again. Less than a month of DLC. Let's go. Bye-bye.